Hello, my name is Don Weaver. I'm chairman of the Brevard Veterans Council, and we're here in the library of the Veterans Memorial Center in order to have a special presentation about Vietnam and tremendous service from Colonel Jeff Rogers. Before I introduce Jeff Rogers to you, I wanted to let you know this is part of the Brevard Veterans Back to Class program. This video will be shown throughout Brevard County Public Schools during the spring when there's mandatory coverage of the Vietnam War. Jeff, we certainly appreciate you coming here today. Let me tell you a little bit about Jeff. He grew up all over the world in a number of Army posts. He graduated from West Point in 1968 and obtained a master's degree in business from the University of Northern Colorado in 1974. He first served as an infantry officer in both heavy and light infantry and ranger units, including a combat infantry tour as a rifle platoon leader in the rugged central highlands of Vietnam. He later was assigned as commander of the 106th Finance Battalion in Germany, commander of the 175th Theater Finance Company for U.S. Forces Korea, chief of program and budget for U.S. Army Europe, and commandant of the U.S. Army Finance School. In the private sector, following his retirement from active duty in the United States Army, he served as a senior program manager and vice president of program management with the Science Applications International Corporation, SAIC, as well as an instructor and mentor for aspiring SAIC executives. Jeff and his wife Carly moved to Melbourne in the Suntree area 19 years ago in 2002. Carly was an Army daughter as well, as he had known her since she was 5 years old. They were married in 1968 following Jeff's graduation from West Point. Carly is active in the county to include serving 2 terms as the Republican State Committeewoman for Brevard County. Both feel blessed to have 3 sons and 6 grandchildren. All 3 sons are married and are graduates of West Point, having served numerous combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Colonel Rogers, it's my honor to present you to this special project given to us by the Brevard Public Schools.
Thank you.
Welcome,
Don.
Jeff.
Thank you. Great introduction. I really appreciate it. It is an honor for me to speak to you today, all of you out in Brevard and wherever else this might end up. As Don mentioned, I came from a military heritage. My father was an infantry officer in World War II in Korea, and my 3 sons, as he mentioned, have all served as combat officers following their graduation from West Point in Afghanistan, Kosovo, and Kuwait as well. Now, following retirement, I went into the private sector as a businessman. That's a little bit about who I am, but what I thought I'd talk about today is your Army, our Army, and in particular from a soldier's perspective. During my time as an Army officer, focusing on the Vietnam era, but also a little bit following that particular period. My own experience, as it was just mentioned by Don, as a recently commissioned 22-year-old lieutenant, was that I ended up being a combat leader of infantrymen in Vietnam, serving as a rifle platoon leader, and the time period was 1969 to 1970. I served in both the 4th Infantry Division and later in the 173rd Airborne Brigade. And our platoon was on constant patrol. It was out in the field, as they say, or in the boonies, as we used to say, for weeks at a time. And I'll talk a little bit about how that experience unfolded. Now, most of us who went to Vietnam were prepared tactically, that is to fight the war, for what we would encounter, but not so well politically. And I'll talk a little bit about the political component of this in a moment. But with respect to tactical preparation, as a recent West Point graduates, our junior officer tactical preparation included an abbreviated infantry officer basic course, and fortunately for some, including me, Ranger School. And it was Ranger School, actually, that facilitated my being as tactically prepared as I was to operate successfully in Vietnam. Interestingly, and kind of ironically, the infantry school, where Ranger School and the infantry basic course reside, placed an unusual emphasis on artillery at a time when we were fighting a limited infantry war. The emphasis actually ended up saving my life and the life of the soldiers that served under me one difficult night in Vietnam, which I'll talk about. Now, the Vietnam period, during the period that we had the Vietnam, it was a tough time for our history and for our Army. With respect to the Army itself, we had an Army the size of 1.5 million soldiers. If you can even imagine, today's Army's less than 1/3 of that, under 500,000. That's how big the Army was. And it had to expand from 1 million to 1.5 million to undertake the Vietnam operation. Now, this caused a lot of problems. Some of our junior officers had graduated from high school, gone to basic training, advanced individual training, and then they went to officer candidate school, and in the period of 1 year, they were lieutenants. So we had 18, 19-year-old lieutenants. And in those days, you got promoted to captain, first lieutenant and captain, in 2 years. We had 20-year-old captains, so we had very inexperienced leadership at lower levels. The soldiers themselves were mostly draftees during this period. We did not have a volunteer army until much later. And my opinion, of course, is even though they were draftees, and I can tell you, they served admirably, but they didn't want to be there. They were sort of drafted into being there. They were just tremendous people, but it was a difficult time, and there were difficult other issues. There were race relation issues that were paramount at the time. We had race riots going on in the United States. That same tension was in tactical units that were deployed in Vietnam, and it was difficult. So that's a little bit about the leadership and the soldiers. Now I'll talk a little bit about the environment. The environment was very austere. The climate was something I had never seen before. It was a dry season for half the year and a wet season. And when I say wet, I mean wet, monsoon. It was heavy rains, heavier than I've ever seen, and I live in Florida, and I've been through a number of hurricanes here. I've never seen rain this heavy. You could put your hand out in front of your face and not see it. That's how heavy the monsoon was. And you're out operating in this, and so you're always wet. We had mosquitoes and malaria. I'll talk a little bit about malaria in a second, and leeches. Anytime you cross a water line, and during the wet season there was a water line every 500 meters, and we moved 3 or 4 kilometers a day, you had leeches all over your legs, and you had to get them off. And so it was just kind of inhospitable. And nutrition. We operated 3 days at a time without getting resupplied. We got resupplied every 3 days with 3 days of rations if the weather held. But with the bad weather and the rains, often we didn't get resupplied and soldiers went hungry. And yet they still performed. That's what amazed me. I remember a soldier came up to me one time and said, LT, that was my name, LT, or sir, but the LT stands for lieutenant. It's kind of a Vietnam thing. And said, LT, I'll do anything we have to do, but I just can't be hungry like this. This is one of my best people. And I turned to him and I said, his name was Duke, I'll show you his picture in a minute. I turned to him and said, Duke, I'm just as hungry as you are. And that was enough for him. So there were some difficult times. Equipment, and I'll show you a slide in a little bit about the equipment that we carried. The equipment was extremely heavy, 70 to 80 pounds for each man, ammunition and all kinds of stuff. And we were considered light infantry, but it's a misnomer when you talk about carrying the equipment because it didn't feel very light. I got there and the battalion commander called me into, this was in a fire base, the battalion commander called me into his little Connex container where he had a bunk. He said, I'm going to put you in charge of the 2nd Platoon in the Rifle Company, 1st Battalion, 35th Infantry, and you're replacing Lieutenant Williamson, who was killed 3 days ago. And he explained to me how he got killed. He got killed because the enemy snuck up on his position. His position was known to the enemy because they made a lot of noise late at night and lobbed a lot of mortars and killed 3 people and wounded a bunch of others, and Lieutenant Williamson was killed. And that's what he told me I would be replacing. He said, here's what I want you to do when you get out there. I want you to make sure your people, every night when they come in for the defensive position to set up, that you dig your foxholes and you put overhead cover. Overhead cover meant cutting down trees and putting overhead cover so that if you get mortared, nobody's going to get killed. In my case, and he told me one other thing, make sure that your people take their malaria pills. We used to have a malaria pill on Monday and one every day of the week called the Monday pill, and then every day. Because a lot of soldiers, because of this difficult climate, would not take their malaria pills because that was their ticket to ride, to go back and sit in a hospital, even though malaria might kill them. It was so inhospitable, soldiers didn't want to take their malaria pills. In my case, I had eyeball to tonsil contact every morning. Everybody took their malaria pills, and I didn't have any cases. But back to overhead cover. So the battalion commander said, I want you to dig in and have overhead cover. And what I did when I got out in the field is I dug in every night unless it was rocking, we couldn't. And I made a decision not to cut trees down for overhead cover. Because if you cut the trees down for overhead cover, it makes so much noise that enemy in 2 different places with 2 different compasses can get your exact location. And all I could think of is Lieutenant Williamson getting killed by the mortars, because if the enemy knows where you are and you don't know where they are, that's a tremendous tactical differential. And so I made a decision not to do that. And I'll talk a little bit about an incident one night where that came into play. Now, what I'd like to transition to is the political dimension of the war. It was a toxic political climate during that period. This was the 60s and the very early 70s. And a lot of it had to do with failed political public policy. National Command Authority was naive. I'm being pretty harsh here, I realize. It's got a political tinge to it. Which included treating the effort, the Vietnam War effort, as an insurgency rather than going after the enemy's center of gravity, which was the North Vietnamese Army, which is what we should have done in the first place. Commanders in the field were restricted on what they could do, plus they were over-supervised by political leadership. We know Hitler over-supervised his army in Russia and they lost. You can't have political leadership over-supervised, and we had that going on during the Vietnam War. They were restricted on what they could do. We had the President of the United States, for example, didn't impact me down at my level, but we had the President of the United States, for example, picking targets for Air Force operations rather than letting the field commanders make those decisions, because it was political. The top Army leadership, in my opinion, I was just a lieutenant, 22 years old as I mentioned, the top Army leadership was flawed during this period. And a lot of integrity issues, various ethical lapses. You might remember the term body counts. You were measured on how many bodies you could produce and say that you killed of the enemy. A lot of those numbers were often inflated. And then the awards. The award system was totally bastardized during this period. When I was in Vietnam, my battalion commander was getting ready to leave, and they realized they hadn't given him a very high valor award called the Silver Star, which is number 3 highest award you can get for behind the Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service Cross, and then Silver Star. And so they went through the logs, operational logs, and manufactured some situation he was near so he'd get a Silver Star. This was a common practice for field grade officers, field grade being majors and above. And so you can see what this does to soldiers. Soldiers lose faith in their leadership when they see practices like this. This is how our Army was, and what I'm talking about is the political dimension of the conflict. And then while all this is going on, you've got the protest movement back in the United States. And we get the Stars and Stripes, and they'd fly it out when we'd get our resupply every 3 days, when we were fortunate. And you'd read about this stuff, all the protests, and soldiers being called horrible things, warmongers, people that wanted to start wars. No respect for the soldier, not like today, when a guy gets off an airplane in Atlanta airport coming back from Kuwait or coming back from Afghanistan, people walk up to him and say thank you for your service. It was just the opposite. When you got off the airplane in San Francisco or McCord or one of the air bases out there at SeaTac, people would come up and throw urine on you, razor blades, and have protest things saying how horrible you were. And this is what these soldiers who dedicated so much to our country came home to during that period. And they never got thanked for their service. I never got thanked for my service, but for me it was okay because I went on to stay on as an Army officer and as a professional, and I just considered that part of what it was like. I will tell you this though, many years later I was at an Army football game in Cleveland, Ohio, and I got in an elevator and I had an Army shirt on because, you know, I was for Army, and this guy came up to me and said, "Thank you for your service." That had never happened before. This is in the 80s, and I was almost in tears. It was really a meaningful experience. So this was the kind of thing that the soldiers had to look forward to when they went home. I have to tell you a quick story. This was just told to me a few months ago. This is a naval officer. He got off the airplane in San Francisco, and a bunch of Army guys were there, and they were said, and back in those days you could go all the way down to the gate. You know, they didn't have TSA or anything, and the protesters were right there. And they said, "Well, what do we do?" He was a lieutenant, a Navy lieutenant. "What do we do, Lieutenant?" And he said, "You guys stick with me." So he got these 5 Army guys himself, went in his duffel bag, and he was going to a wedding. So he pulled out the ceremonial saber you see at a wedding when they cross sabers and everything. He said, "You guys just follow me." And he pulled his saber out and walked out of the airport, and those protesters stayed the heck away from him. I just heard this story a few months ago, and it worked. But that's the kind of environment that the soldiers came through. And then, besides all that, the challenges when you're over there is the enemy. Hello? That's the main reason you're there. And of course, that's the biggest threat. And that's what our soldiers had to face. Now, I had a number of engagements when I was in Vietnam, but I'm going to tell you about one in particular. I had been given a 2nd platoon. I had the 1st platoon, and the 2nd platoon was Lieutenant Gill was the platoon leader. I'll show you his picture in a minute. Unfortunately, he was killed a few days later, but he was a dear friend of mine. He was killed in combat. And we were in the Chupao Mountains, one of the most dangerous parts of Vietnam in the Central Highlands. And we were to go across this deep divide, and there were enemy activity everywhere, and go on the other side, set up, and try to find enemy and try to engage them and kill them, or at least spot them so that we could engage them with artillery. So we get up there on the top of the side of a hill to dig in, found a fairly safe location, we thought, and it's pure rock. So we're not digging in that night. So I got everybody out. His platoon was a little noisier than mine. Noise discipline was a big deal to me, because I always can think of 2 people with a compass, and they find you and you're dead. His platoon was a little noisier, and a couple of my guys came, "Hey, LT, can you tell Lieutenant Gill to have his people be quiet?" I mean, they were that conscious of it, so at least they had understood what I was trying to get across. Anyway, so we got set in for the night. Then about 10 o'clock at night, our mortar rounds start landing around our position. So the enemy knew we were there. They had heard us, and they were going to mortar our position, and they were getting closer and closer. In the meantime, I had a firing battery, a 105 firing battery, about 10 kilometers away at Placerang, and our company CP was 5 kilometers away on another hilltop just between. And I didn't fire targets in for protection. Every night when we moved into a position, I'd fire artillery to mark the location, so if the enemy came, I could adjust and engage them. I didn't do it that night because I wasn't allowed to, because it was called gun target. It was over the friendly forces, and they don't fire over friendly forces. Friendly fire is a big deal. Well, that night I called and I said, "Hey, you guys got to fire this mission for me. I know it's gun target, but we're about to get really messed up here." And they knew me, and I was pretty good at calling in artillery, what I was taught in the infantry school, and they fired the mission for me. And first was a smoke round so that we knew we were safe, and then the enemy would fire a mortar, get it closer, and what I ended up doing is pitch black at night, dense foliage everywhere, triple canopy jungle. I can't see where the rounds are landing, but I could hear them. And I adjusted by sound. And every time one of my rounds landed, I moved it closer to where his rounds launched from, because I could hear the tubes popping the mortars at us. And they were getting close. We had shrapnel in our perimeter, but nobody was hurt yet. And then one time they pooped around at us to find us, and I came down with 5 rounds on top of where I thought he was, and all of a sudden the mortaring stopped. Now, I don't know if we got him, or if he said, "I know if I fire one more round, I'm history," and they stopped. And so it saved our lives. And it was an interesting thing, because I'd been taught to adjust fires, and I ended up having to do it by sound. So that's my one war story, and fortunately for me and for the soldiers, we survived that evening. But through all of this, with all the difficulty I've talked about, the one thing that stands out to me, and always has, and has always humbled me actually, is the extraordinariness of our American soldier. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but they have my total admiration. Now what I'd like to do is transition to a post-Vietnam era, what I call the Post-Vietnam Hangover. And I told you about how our Army was stretched thin, leadership was a problem, and ethics was a problem. Now the soldiers we had in the late 60s and 70s, when you came back from Vietnam and went to another military installation, were problematic. There was much indiscipline, refusing to obey orders, refusing to go on alerts, disrespect to officers. I had an alert in a caserne in Germany. The brigade commander, one rifle company, went up on the third floor of the barracks and refused to go on alert. You know, we always alerted once a month for the Russian coming, so to speak. And one of them threw a trash can out at the brigade commander, and nothing happened. That's how bad things were. You go in another unit and it'd say NCO's not authorized here. Drugs. This was a bad situation in the late 60s and early 70s. What we ended up having, we had a change of political leadership in 1980, and a lot of money spent on the military. Plus the Army was a lot smaller, so you could get rid of a lot of the dead weight that was causing many of these problems. We ended up bringing in quality soldiers, requiring them to have a high school diploma, which makes a difference. If they've been successful in high school, the chances of them being a successful soldier are greatly increased. We had better leadership. Many of our officers that were a problem, the Lieutenant Callies is a famous story of abuse, and those kinds of people were gone. Better equipment, and people were motivated to remain. In fact, soldiers would go home and talk up the Army. That's the quality Army we had by the mid-80s, the one that we deployed to the desert the first time, that was so successful right away. And it appears to me that we've recently repeated some of the same mistakes we made during the Vietnam era. And it's kind of cyclical. It's like political leadership. We kind of let the military go to you-know-what in a handbasket, or we spend money on it, make sure that we have quality leaders, and get it to the state where it can be a highly effective force. And we've been back and forth through that with the changes in political leadership. But through all this turbulence, which as I mentioned seems to be cyclical, the one thing that remains constant to me is the grandeur and nobility of the American soldier. I found, in my experience, that the American soldier will do anything you ask, but it must be legal and ethical, of course. As long as that soldier is properly and caringly led, soldiers will do anything. If they believe in you as a leader and they trust you, they'll do what you ask them to do. Now what I thought I would do is go over the equipment we carried in some charts, and then show you a few photos of what actually, I'm actually very lucky to have these photos, because I never took a photo the whole time I was in Vietnam. The soldiers that served under me did. And back then, you know, you used to mail your photos off and then they'd come back developed, and they would do a kindness to me. They would mail them off and get dupes and say, LT, you want one of these? And they'd give me a couple. So those are the only photos I have. You'll see them in a minute. They're a little bit grainy, but I'll talk you through them and what they all mean. So I think what we'll do now is break while we go and look at the get the photo thing set up, and then I'll continue from there. Thank you all so much. As I mentioned, I want to show you some of the slides, actual photographs from the era. Now some of these are going to be grainy because of the technology situation that we have here, but I'll explain them to you because it kind of gives you a flavor of what it was like during that period. First thing I'll show you is the two units I served in. As I mentioned, I served in the 1st Battalion, 35th Infantry, and the 4th Infantry Division, and I also served in the 173rd Airborne Brigade. That's actually me in front of the brigade headquarters sign. Now, let's talk about the equipment that the soldiers carried. 70 to 80 pounds. Every person carried his personal weapon, the M16A1 rifle, which fired both semi and automatic. We had 20-round magazines. The enemy had 30-round magazines with their AK-47. They hadn't distributed 30-round magazines for the M16 yet by this period. We were only allowed to have 18 rounds in the chamber, in the magazine, because of jamming. I always had more, and I made sure my magazine operated as well as it could. we had 3 M79 grenade launchers, 1 in each squad, and these could fire out to 100 meters and engage a target, and they had to carry those 40 millimeter rounds, and they were heavy. And 2 M60 machine guns with over 1,000 rounds of ammunition. Now that ammunition is heavy, so what we did is we spread it around the platoon to different people. One guy'd carry 100 rounds, another guy'd carry 100 rounds. Again, adding to the weight. The basic load for M16 was 240 rounds, as you see here. As you see right here. The soldiers I served with, we carried 400 rounds because you didn't know when you'd get supplied. When you get into an engagement with an enemy, ammunition's the most precious thing you have, and you want to have as much of it as possible. That added to the weight. The basic load for a grenadier, as I mentioned, was 40 rounds, but they usually carried more. And then the extra rounds that we carried for the machine gun. We also carried hand grenades. These devices are very dangerous. And if a pin gets caught on a foliage as you're walking and it comes off, it could kill 3 or 4 people. So we had to do all kinds of things to protect against getting ourselves killed by our own hand grenades. One thing is when we take them out of the box, we bend the pins back and we put them in such a way that we never had a hand grenade accident. But it's very dangerous, but very effective tool when you're in close combat with the enemy. White phosphorus is a very dangerous grenade. Spews white phosphorus out some 30 meters, and if a little bit of that lands on you, there's nothing you can do about it. It's very bad. And we use smoke for signaling. When we brought in resupply at night, or during the day, every 3 days, excuse me, we had to let the enemy, the friendlies, know where we were, so that, and not the enemy. And so we would throw a smoke grenade out so the helicopter could find us to bring in our resupply. And in the early part of the war, they used to throw a smoke grenade color and say, hey, I got cherry smoke out, and the enemy would throw out 3 cherry smoke grenades and the helicopter would land in the wrong place and get engaged. So we changed our modus operandi, and we would put out a smoke, and then the helicopter pilot would identify, hey, I see yellow smoke, and say, yep, that's us. I see blue smoke, that isn't us. And they'd come in and land. And so that's why smoke grenades were very important to us. The rucksack was what we carried all our equipment, and plus we carried load-bearing equipment, the pistol belt, without the suspenders. Water. We carried lots of water. Water was always an issue. We drank the water in the field from the streams. During the dry season, it was hard to get water because you very rarely found a blue line that had water in it. During the wet season, it wasn't a problem. I personally carried 7 quarts of water, a 5-quart bladder bag and 2 1-quart canteens, because I'm a big water drinker. I'm drinking it all the time. But it's heavy, and that was part of the load. But it was important. 3 days meals I've talked about. A poncho. You put up a poncho at night. We'd make a little poncho hooch to try to shield us from the rain. A poncho liner was like a blanket, but if it got dry for a minute, you could hang it up and the rain would evaporate from it. I carried an air mattress, and of course we had clipper ants that would bite through them and they wouldn't last that long. But I like to sleep in luxury, so when we got in at night, I slept on an air mattress. And it was a personal hygiene. Carried personal hygiene items, toothbrush, shaving equipment, toilet paper, cigarettes, I mentioned tobacco here, and other personal hygienes. Plus, family photos, personal letters. I had every letter my wife wrote me. When I go back to base camp after a long patrol, I'd put it in a footlocker back there. But I had them in a waterproof bag in my pocket so I could reread them as they came out with the resupply. And protected tobacco items, and as I mentioned, sometimes mosquito nets. Now here's what happened with mosquito nets. We got back to a fire base one time, and a big panic about malaria came, and they said every soldier will carry a mosquito net and sleep under it at night. So we all had to have mosquito nets. Another 7 to 15 pounds of extra stuff. It was the funniest thing. About one day out, I kept seeing all these mosquito nets accidentally fall off these packs and get lost in the woods. Because we didn't need mosquito nets. We put heavy insect repellent on at night, kept the mosquitoes off, and during the day the mosquitoes weren't a real problem. But it just shows you how innovative soldiers can be when they get a stupid order. The platoon itself carried 3 radios that we could call in our location, call in artillery, call in resupply. 3 D-handle shovels because the entrenching tool is ineffective in Vietnam. A large medical bag carried by the medic, which included all the malaria tablets and everything else, 3 machetes, because we were cutting through heavy jungle all the time just to get from point A to point B. Trip flares, because we set up at night, we'd put trip flares around our location, so if the enemy tried to sneak in and attack us, they'd set off a trip flare, then we could pop our claymores and kill them instantly and engage them. And they wouldn't know exactly where we were, but we could tell where they were if they set off a trip flare. And if we were with the mortar platoon, which we were occasionally, which traveled with the company commander, we had to carry a mortar around, which is another 20 pounds or so. Now I'm going to go through a few photographs. These are going to be hard to see because, as I mentioned, they're grainy, but I'll describe what's in them. This is a picture of us when we had just gotten our resupply and we're getting ready to go back out on patrol. This person right here that I'm pointing to is Lieutenant Gill, and he was killed later. He's a dear friend of mine. Over here, and that's yours truly in the center. Here's yours truly again with Sergeant Grider. He was my 20-year-old, get this, 20-year-old platoon sergeant. He's the number 2 guy, only 20 years old. And that's the way the Army was back in then. He was great in the field. He was just a tremendous field soldier. Took a few years for him to get to being a garrison type soldier, but in the field he was tremendous. Here's the helicopters coming in to resupply us. Helicopter here, this is back in October, and you can see it's starting to throw the mail off to us, sea rations and stuff for another 3 days for us to continue our operations. These are a compilation of pictures. Unfortunately, they're hard for you to see if you're viewing this, but this gentleman up here in the corner was a full-blooded American Indian, Native American, and his last name, he had a Hispanic last name, Gomez, but we just called him Chief. And he wasn't with me very long because he left with malaria. He was left over from the previous platoon leader, and they weren't watching malaria, and he was anxious to get out of there, so he contracted malaria, unfortunately. A couple soldiers in the field as we were getting ready. This is a soldier that came and asked me about why we have to be so hungry. His name, Duke and Broad was his last name. We just call him Duke. And some of the other soldiers. This one soldier right here I'm pointing to was named Robert Hockadell. This was a mama's boy from upstate New York. His equipment was always screwed up. His weapon was never clean. It actually exploded one night when he tried to operate it. And he was just not a good soldier. But we kind of liked him. And I have this image in my mind, and you can't see me, I'm not in front of the screen right now. But I have this image in my mind. We were out in a night location, and it was raining, misty. And I saw this guy on the ridge line going to the location where I'd sent him. And his pack was all screwed up and stuff hanging off of it. And I looked at him and I said, you know, that was just an amazing image to me because he was just a tremendous guy. And the thing about Robert Hockadell is he was there. And that's what always inspired me. Even though he was a flaky soldier, he was there and he did what we asked him to do. So that kind of gives you an impression of what these wonderful people were. Here we are again. This gentleman here, Robert Heiser, I saw in the last 5 years, he's passed now, and a soldier from another platoon. Here they are back in the base camp, in a fire base, excuse me. Every once in a while we'd go back and pull security on a fire base where the artillery pieces were, and that would give us kind of a respite because we got to sleep in a bunker and actually on a cot, and so we felt that that was kind of a luxury. Here's yours truly when we're getting ready to go into a night logger with our weapons. There I am after having dug a foxhole for the night. We dug, as I mentioned, we dug in every night. Here I am actually executing the digging in at night, and I'm having a soda and looking at the map and figuring out how we're going to get to where we're going the next day. And as I mentioned at the outset, all of this was during 1969 and early 70, is when during the period that I was there. There you can't see me, I can barely see it in this, and my radio telephone operator, or RTO for short, calling in our location to let the higher headquarters know where we were that night. And then I would call in artillery and place artillery rounds around the perimeter so that we'd know and be able to call fires in if the enemy attacked us. Here I am up in a tree, and I don't know why I was up there. And then here I am with two of the soldiers. There's the radio telephone operator, and this is a sergeant from Nebraska, Larson, Sergeant Larson. He was one of the squad leaders. Here I am in the night logger as we had just gotten dug in, and you can see I'm on my air mattress, which was the lap of luxury. But we had guards out everywhere. Of course, we had our security out. Some could relax and some were on security. This was an interesting situation. Here, these are Montagnard right here, which are the local natives in the Highlands, along with the oxen. We'd been sent out to recon this one city, the Montagnard city, where we think the enemy was hiding a headquarters. And I was sent to look for this. We got right outside the city, and they weren't in there, so we were going to set up for the night and ambush them if they came back. This guy walks right into our position. Walks right in. And so we're sitting there saying, what am I going to do with this guy? I can't turn him loose and send him back to the city. And so we told him, we didn't know how to speak Montagnard. We just got very friendly with him, told him you have to stay here. We gave him some of our sea rations, and he had a great time. He did not feel threatened. And then in the morning, we said goodbye to him, and he went to his position. But that was kind of an interesting situation. I had to make a decision. Are we going to retain this guy, or are we going to let him go back into the city, and into his Montagnard town? And I decided we'd keep him for the night. Here's some more pictures of the soldiers in different venues. This is Sergeant Larson, one squad leader, and Sergeant Muxo when we were in a fire base. Sergeant Muxo right here, and I'll show you him in a minute. He was the old man of the platoon. He was 25 years old. He had been to college and then drafted into the Army. This is yours truly when we were back in a base camp. I was in a real uniform here, working in an area not with the platoon. And now we're going to fast forward to right here in Melbourne. Here's yours truly, many years later, in front of the Vietnam Memorial that comes here to Melbourne every year. And I went one time, and there's Sergeant Muxo, and he and I reunited right down here in Melbourne at the monument as we honored soldiers that we knew that had been lost. So this really concludes what I have to say. We've covered a lot and given you a lot to digest about the service as a soldier in difficult circumstances. It was a privilege for me to have served with such great Americans, and an experience I've treasured my entire life. I thank you all for your attention.